superintelligence we're waiting for. It is already here.
I think we can move from a future of artificial general intelligence to a future of augmented collective intelligence.
AI can make the government more efficient, more effective.
Science fiction futures are possible.
And one of the reasons I'm so excited about this episode is because I had the pleasure, Divya, of meeting you over a year ago, and then we got to reconnect a few weeks ago, hearing everything that's going on in CIB. And for the first time ever, Audrey, we reached out to a guest and we said, we're so excited, Audrey, to have you on the show. And you said, oh, I'm excited too, but I need to have my partner in crime, Divya, on the show as well. So Audrey, I would love to hear from you. Tell me about sort of your partnership and the history that you two have together in sort of working towards this, civic citizen democracy.
Yeah, certainly. So a couple of years ago, CIP Collective Intelligence Project launched with the project called Alignment Assemblies. The idea is that AI caused a lot of harms to society, like sophisticated deepfakes, scam advertisements, and so on. How about let's just use AI to listen better to people in society and how to tune these AI systems and laws around them to work for the better. And so I was part of the Summit for Democracy to launch Alignment Assemblies. And last year, for example, Taiwan was flooded with such deepfake investment scams, sometimes featuring the NVIDIA guy, Jensen Huang, trying to give you some free crypto to return to the country or something like that. But of course, if you click it, Jensen talks to, but it's deepfake, probably running on NVIDIA GPU. And the people were clamoring for action, but were very fearful that Taiwanese government regulation could lead to censorship, because Taiwan is, after all, the most free society in all of Asia when it comes to internet freedom. So we sent SMS to 200,000 people randomly, random numbers in Taiwan, and 450 people, a civic jury, representative of our entire society, were volunteered and convened. And for a full day, we deliberated online in groups of 10, 45 of such rooms, facilitated by AI. And they came up with very good ideas. For example, all scams advertisements are because they don't have KYC, they don't have digital signature. So unless Jensen Huang signs off on that advertisement, it should be assumed as scam. And another room said, if Facebook posts such advertisements, we shouldn't just fine them. If somebody gets scammed $5 million, Facebook should be liable for that $5 million. Another room says TikTok ByteDance doesn't even have a Taiwan office at the time, so they could just ignore us. In which case, we should slow down connection to their servers so their business goes to their advertisements, competitors, and so on. And so these ideas are generated by people, summarized by AI in real time, and allowing for rapid confirmation. And after one day of deliberation, those proportional ideas that received more than 85% of support across age, gender, and political parties just became law in a couple of months. And so that was one of the first projects we launched together, Alignment Assemblies. And this particular one on information integrity was really impactful.
Although actually we've known each other for a long time, and that's because I was called into doing a bunch of COVID policy early on in the pandemic. I used to live in India. I was doing a lot of on-ground work. I took the last international flight out back to the US, couldn't keep doing anything. This was not a Zoom amenable job I was doing. And so got pulled into COVID policy, and that's how I learned about Audrey's work in Taiwan, because while we were desperately trying to set up very basic contact tracing and trying to convince the public in a lot of ways, hey, it's okay to have Bluetooth contact tracing, the government's not tracking you, we can do testing, all of that. We looked over, Taiwan is doing this absolutely, basically science fiction, incredible job with COVID. And I met Audrey then to try to bring some of what was succeeding in Taiwan to the US. I would call it mixed at best in terms of success, but since then have been super inspired by the work and have thought a lot about what does it look like to translate those successes to different contexts, because the infrastructure that's present in Taiwan, I think, does allow for the kinds of science fiction governance scenarios that we haven't seen in other places yet.
One of the things I would take as a positive surprise was how well the initial things worked in, kind of having AI kind of participate in the conversation, have a deliberative democracy of different kinds of concerns and ideas and summarize them up. I'm curious if there's other positive surprises. I'm also curious what the challenges discovered were, because I think it's like this is the future as it should be relative to, elements of democratic governance. And it's one of the reasons why we're excited to have this podcast is we want to get people thinking about the work that you guys have been doing. So, what are some of the other positive surprises, and then what are some of the challenges you've discovered?
One thing we discovered very early on was how people in Taiwan wanted the government to experiment with AI in such settings, because they see like ChatGPT and so on, and they see that it doesn't really summarize or even translate very well using Taiwanese vocabulary, using Taiwanese cultures, and so on. So there's a general wish to culturally align those models. And that's why we also launched the trustworthy AI dialogue engine, the Taiwan fine-tuning of Llama, again, using alignment assemblies to put together a set of what's called constitutional documents or just model specifications. So very early on, a couple of years ago, we already have like a set of specifications from Tainan City, from Taipei City, and we tune Llama differently so that it fits how people expect that AI in government settings would behave, like a code of conduct. So that's something very surprising, because you would think that people will find it strange, find it weird, and so on. No, people actually eased into it very easily, and then starting demanding you speak like a local.
Yeah, I think what's been surprising to me, I'm sometimes at my least optimistic right before we run a very big process. You're bringing together thousands or tens of thousands of people, huge logistics overhead. Sometimes we're doing it with, an AI lab like OpenAI and Anthropic. Then you have to think about the leverage points there. Sometimes you're doing it with a government. You have to set up all the moderation filters beforehand. And it's right at the point where we're launching it that I'm like, this is the time people are going to have terrible ideas and everyone's going to be horrible to each other and we're not going to come up with anything 100%. And every time I'm surprised. Maybe that tells you something about me, but genuinely it's really beautiful in a way to see that people are so much more nuanced and engaged than you'd expect, often much less polarized than I think the higher level discourse would lead you to believe. And it's not that every time someone says something in a collective input process, it's a gem and you want to turn it into legislation right away. But it often is the case, like Audrey was pointing out, that people come up with what we tend to call uncommon ground. So common ground is, it's easy to find consensus over what you might think of as like a live, love, laugh statement. Like, sure, you pull hundreds of thousands of people, they're going to say kids are important, we love rainbows, whatever. But how do you find the uncommon ground? And I think that's where it's been most interesting to me. Okay, people have trade-offs between things like censorship and hate speech that we actually want to use, that we need those trade-offs for, because no one has a great idea about how to solve those problems, right? So I think that has been most exciting to me. The challenges aren't surprising in a way. I mean, the challenges are, it's our responsibility to ask questions that people can have interesting answers to. When we don't ask good questions, we don't get good information. And I think that's on us, basically. I think the second is to move people away from a conception of democracy that's very voting or individualistic based, or the belief that, hey, if we just talk about things and we can solve everything with direct democracy, which is like also clearly not true. There's a reason we moved past it, right? So how do we actually bring in the new thinking that frontier technology allows us to these really old questions that people actually feel very strongly about?
Divya, I have two sort of big questions. One is, can you talk about the problem we're trying to solve? Is the problem we're trying to solve, we need better ideas, and so that's why we're going to go to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands? Is it that we need a process that everyone believes in? And then in the solution, what's important? Not to solve it, but to have sort of the best possible outcome when you're doing these sort of deliberative democracy movements.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think a lot about the distinction between democracy and collective intelligence when answering this, not that they're not both great. I think there are three things that we want from democracy. We want buy-in and legitimacy, right? I mean, we want people to feel like they were involved in decisions so that they will then continue to support those decisions. They'll wear a mask for the good of the society. I mean, part of the original democracies, it was like, I want to vote on war so that when I send my son to war, I feel like that's my war. That kind of buy-in and legitimacy is a core function of democracy. The second is, I think, a belief in agency. People should have control over their lives. This is something that people who believe in democracy are united by, so we want that piece. And the third is good decisions. None of this works. You think about input and output legitimacy. Sure, we can have great processes, but if we're not succeeding, then it doesn't matter. So I think those are the three things we want to preserve. And as I think we're hinting at, there's trade-offs between these, right? Speed of decisions can trade off with level of buy-in, as anyone who's even tried to go to dinner with 10 friends knows. And level of agency can trade off with good decisions as well. So what we think about in trying to move from just what we now feel as democracy to a world of collective intelligence, we try to say, how do we preserve as many of these as possible? So like, okay, let's have lots of people involved because that's necessary for buy-in and legitimacy. Every time people participate in their processes, around 70% of them say, I have never felt listened to before. And this is a problem we want to solve. We want to solve that at the buy-in and legitimacy space, right? We believe in agency. That's why we're running these processes, but they're not as directly tied to power as an election is. When we run a process with tens of thousands of people to say what values should AI have and build that into the models, we have many expert layers between the collective input process and the model, partly just for practicality. So there's a way in which we want to preserve the agency while keeping the good decisions. And then finally, we have seen time and time again, as we build transformative technologies, we can't perfectly simulate the world. It's the kind of collective sensors that people have inherently by sharing their lived experiences, failure modes, ideas that make those decisions good. So that's kind of how we think about, okay, what do we need to have and how do we trade them off?
We obviously see collective stupidity in some of the ways that the major social media platforms encourage, kind of a sense of, sloganeering, name calling, division, etc. But what are some of the kind of key insights by which we get to the intelligence part of it? Because by the way, that obviously then also plays into legitimacy and everything else because it's kind of like, hey, this is working. This is a good thing.
I think Audrey is the best person in the world to answer this question.
Thank you. One of the very early learnings 10 years ago when we deliberated on the Uber case in Taiwan was that people are just much nicer when they know that other people are listening. That is to say, if you poll people individually, they're going to give you quite extreme ideas, quite extreme positions at that. And even worse, if it's on social media through this engagement through enragement algorithm, then those extreme voices actually gets more views, retweets, and so on. And so using the bridging system called Polis 10 years ago, what we did was we take away the reply button and the retweet buttons. You can see one statement from your fellow citizen. Maybe they say, insurance is a great idea, a professional license is a great idea, but sometimes more nuanced statements like surge pricing is fine, but undercutting existing meters is not fine, and so on. And then you see your avatar among the people who share the same ideas with you, and you see the other group or the other groups. And then we give virality to the statements that are bridging. That is to say, among people who vote differently, if there's one or two statements that can convince both sides or all the different sides, then these statements gain visibility and virality. So it's almost the reverse of the antisocial corners of traditional social media. And that really changed people's behavior because once they have a friendly competition on how more bridging can we be, we ended up after 3 weeks getting a very coherent set of legislation around Uber, which then we passed into law.
Can you say more about, you had an interesting distinction that perhaps like misinformation is not the appropriate thing to talk about, and we're not sort of looking for truth. So how would you frame sort of misinformation and what we should be shooting for in the social media realm?
Well, again, I think in terms of the behavior, that is to say, if information is contested, is it polarizing? For example, one very early example during the COVID was that there was a strain of meme that said in early 2020, only N95 masks are useful, the highest grade mask. The other masks are not useful. And there's another strain of memes says it's ventilation, it's aerosol, any kind of mask hurts you. N95 hurts you the most. And these two kind of start polarizing just by debating each other. They mutate into more and more extreme forms. And so using this idea of uncommon ground, we needed to discover very quickly what are the depolarizing ideas that both sides can find agreement on. So within 24 hours, we pushed out a very cute meme, a Shiba Inu, a Doge dog, putting her paw to her mouth saying, wear a mask to protect your own mouth from your own dirty, unwashed hands. So it reassociates mask wearing to just reminder of hand washing. There's no big deal in that. It was so cute, so it went viral. And then we mapped the tap water usage. It really did increase. And so the idea here is that people do not actually want to polarize. If there is a way to do humor over rumor, to do pre-bunking, then people converge on that uncommon ground. It's only in a vacuum of that uncommon ground do people seek polarization.
I think this is, whether it's very explicit or somewhat implicit, one of the questions we get asked most often is basically like, but everyone's dumb and terrible. Like, why would you want to be asking them questions? And I think there is a reality in which we want to be bringing out the best in people and the best in what they can contribute, and also being very clear on what kinds of questions should be put to large groups versus not. A collective intelligence mechanism that works in one situation doesn't work in another, right? I mean, famously, I think Sears and the World Bank at one point tried to bring markets internally. They were like, markets are amazing. They're so good for innovation and competition. Let's turn our company into more of a market system, and the different entities within the company should have to buy and sell and compete with each other. Went terribly. That doesn't mean markets aren't good. It means they created collective stupidity within the structure in which they were deployed at that point. I think similarly, it's true of all of our collective intelligence mechanisms. You don't want to use a bureaucracy when a decentralized democratic structure will work, and you don't want to do it the other way as well. So a lot of what I think about is, okay, as AI transforms the future, what collective intelligence mechanisms are good for what types of decisions that we make? We don't want to create homogenous outputs from models. We don't want to create agents that people don't trust. We don't want to assign autonomy to things that could go badly. And we do need both collective signal on what people are seeing and also collective input on what they want to see for those questions. That doesn't mean I would go out to the streets of San Francisco and hold up this mic to someone and say, what should we evaluate GPT-5 on? So how do we think about the moments and the ways in which we can actually use the affordances of collective intelligence appropriately to create collective intelligence?
Well, and like one of the things that, Audrey gestured at earlier, which I think is both of your work, is this kind of question as if it feels that someone's actually listening to me and participating in the dialogue, I will be more responsive, maybe more centrist, maybe more, trying to do the bridging incentive.
Before we get on to sort of more topics of AI, because I'm sure we're going to dive deep into that, I just wanted to make sure I understood sort of the distinction between this, again, collective intelligence, democracy. Like, how is this different than polling? For instance, my coworkers are going to make a lot of fun of me, but let's take congestion pricing, one of my favorite policies in all the world. If you looked at polling and if you asked people on the street, they hate congestion pricing. It's terrible. It's the worst thing ever. It had a under 30% approval rating. But then it's implemented because, smart policymakers thought it made sense in New York City. And now that approval rating has skyrocketed to 55, 60, 65%. And so how do you deal with people's sort of understanding of the policy not actually being what they're going to feel when the policy is implemented? And please feel free to tell me, like, Aria, you're totally misunderstanding this. This is the distinction between polling, collective intelligence, and sort of this deliberative democracy.
It's just like saying, one person, one vote, or like one telephone call and one polling survey. Of course, these are like early rudimentary collective intelligence systems. We know for a fact that if you poll people individually, they're more extreme. If you poll people in a group and allow people to play off each other's idea, they become not just more centrist, but much more nuanced, much more creative. And so you can think of these processes as polling groups. And these groups are, like in the Taiwanese alignment assembly case, statistically representative so that we can show our legislators, actually, if you get 450 people that satisfies this stratified random polling, it's as rigorous as a poll, but it has much more generative ideas.
So obviously one of the things that the whole world is very focused on these days, not just us on this podcast, but generally, is artificial intelligence and the way that it plays into kind of a more human future. Obviously I published a book on this earlier the sheer and superagency. What are some of your thoughts about what is kind of like, because, I think the driving force for the creation of AI will be various commercial centers. There's, I think, actually a number of physics reasons that's true, and a number of economic reasons, and a number of maybe even just like that's the basis by which this kind of technology gets created. What, from a viewpoint of kind of society, civic discourse, buy-in, what are some of the things you think are important for technologists to be thinking about in terms of the creation of this, given it'll be created in, call it 10 different or 15 or 20 different companies, with some dialogue? What are some of the design principles? What are some of the questions to be asked? What are some of the really important things to make sure you do, this rather than that?
I started CIP because I was worried about whether democracy, not nation state democracy, but the idea of people being able to control their own lives would keep pace with AI. And I was also excited about, on the flip side, what AI could do for democracy. And I think I still feel both of those things. And what we have focused on is how do we bring a lot of people, not just into the conversation at a high level, but we actually should be building collective preferences into models. I see our current iteration of AI architecture as collective intelligence in and of itself, right? We're training on the sum total of human knowledge, plus, of course, a bunch of synthetic data. And it is a collective intelligence system. The reason it works is because it's an excellent collective intelligence system. When I talk to GPT, I'm talking to a very successful collective intelligence. And how do we move in a more collective direction? So I think that's kind of the information piece, right, of collective intelligence. It's like people have really excellent information. We work with hundreds of people in India who are deploying these models and seeing failure modes that no other kind of major lab is seeing because they're not looking in those places. We talk to tens of thousands of people every couple months to think about how are they evaluating models? What do they want to see in the future? We're building that back into evals because we think they see something other people can't, because we need these sensors. There's also kind of the more squishy, how do we keep our humanity piece? And I think this comes from almost the Aristotelian view that participating in self-governance is what makes us human. Having agency over our lives is what makes us human. We don't want to get into a place where we're homogenizing output, where we're losing culture, where we're, having agents or entities make decisions for us and slowly erode what it means to be human. And so the projects we do where we go to different countries in the world and try to get people on the ground who are deploying models to share and build benchmarks together.
Divya, you nodded to it that you are working with thousands, tens of thousands of people across the globe to get their input into these frontier models. So can you go like a click deeper and how does that actually work? And then how do you take the input and then what is done with it?
The first project we did like this with Audrey and others was with Anthropic, where we looked for a leverage point in the model training process, right? As we talked about earlier, it's not just that you can go to people and ask them to shift the architecture of pre-training or something like that. So with the Anthropic training process, there was a very clear leverage point, which is the Constitution. The model is trained partly on a constitution, a set of natural language principles that say things like always help the user as much as possible, or things like that. And so those are things that people can really weigh into. And we worked with them to run a process. This was just in the US, bringing thousands of people together and just rewriting that constitution. What do the people want from the constitution? One thing we found is that the people's constitution, so to speak, was much more positively oriented. Not in an optimism sense. It was more like AI should do this. We want you to do this. Always do these things. Whereas the research constitution was a lot more like, don't do this. Stay away from this. And so I think that already shows you the kind of shift that can happen when people get brought in. But then we just retrained Claude on the new constitution. And now the versions of Claude, this was a few years ago, but the versions of Claude that are in production have some of the principles from that constitution that people created, right? So I think that's one very easy story of a leverage point in which collective input is possible. The model spec is another possibility there. Evaluation is something that we're focusing on now as a good point for collective input, where you said, we bring these tens of thousands of people together. And what do they say? This is with civil society organizations, actually. Like, I tried to deploy this chatbot to my 10,000 beneficiaries for maternal health in India, and it's having all of these problems. It's always saying we should call a hotline. There are no hotlines here. That's crazy. Like, we have to change this. Otherwise, people are not getting the help they need. So we're gathering tons of that information and creating benchmarks and trying to improve models on those benchmarks. So that's another way. A third thing is, we've been thinking a lot about how humans and AI interact. Like in our recent global dialogues, we found 1 in 3 adults are using AI for emotional support weekly. People trust chatbots far more than their elected representatives and basically more than any other institution they interact with other than their family doctor. So what does this mean for the future that we're going to build? On one hand, lots of concerning things about that. On the other, it's clear that there's already trust here. How do we leverage that? The last thing is, can we use AI to make this stuff better? Like, that's what we're excited about with Remesh, with these platforms we're using, is how do we actually build the technology into being able to do listening much better than we currently do? Better than polling,
Part of what I infer from your work is to say, well, when people are engaged, actually being kind of respected and intrigued in their point of view, there's a much larger percentage of people that kind of want to, build those bridges or get to bridging comments or to kind of figure that out. And if you have high quality moderation and dialogue participant, that could be helpful. And that's the kind of thing that is part of a, kind of a positive future that I would hope for. But it's kind of one of the things that, maybe it's naive for me to be hopeful for, but the kind of notion of kind of almost like taking what we do in very limited circumstances, which to have, extremely highly trained moderators facilitating conversation. And just like AI makes things cheaper everywhere, to make that cheaper across a whole wide variety. Have you guys, speculated about that at all?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, it's no longer sci-fi. In Bowling Green, for example, in Kentucky, just this year, there's a project called What Could BG Be? They use the same system, the bridging system Polis, to shape the city's 25 years plan. And despite the sometimes polarized nature of American discourse, the platform reviewed overwhelming uncommon ground on key issues like preserving historic buildings, investing in public health, building a cultural identity different from the nearby Nashville, and so on. And nearly 8,000 residents participated, showing that even in such hyper-local communities, these shared values can be surfaced and mobilized. And a key part of this is the open source Jigsaw SenseMaker that was deployed as part of the Polis system. So previously, if you have tens of thousands of those groups and so on, it takes a while for people to go in and figure out what topics, what subtopics are within it. But now using language models, you can do it and you can replicate that using the open source equivalent model, like Gemma or Mistral running on laptops. You can verify these biases and correct them if you want.
Audrey, it seems like there's so much that the United States can learn from what you're doing in Taiwan. Are there sort of favorite use cases you have for using AI to sort of increase the civic participation do you think could be exported elsewhere, or what are the challenges in doing that?
Well, I think the idea that Taiwan was the largest model is no longer true this year. In California, we launched Engaged California, and California is like twice larger than Taiwan. And the platform was used successfully to tackle contentious issues like wildfire recovery, how to build back better, and so on. And already in the city of Tokyo, there was a 33-year-old science fiction author called Takehiro Ano, machine learning expert, who read the book Plurality that we co-authored, and he decided to run for Tokyo governor 1 month before the governor election. And he just crowdsourced his platform, literally using polis and broad listening tools. And again, using AI as a great real-time summarizer, you can call into a line to talk to the vocal clone of Takahiro Ano and see him updating his platform in real time on YouTube 24/7. And just before voting, independently ranked the platforms by those think tanks, the Takahiro Ano platform, crowdsourced, was the top-rated platform, better than even Koike-san's. Of course, Koike-san won the election, but Koike also tapped Takahiro Ano to advise GovTech Tokyo to use this kind of systems to, again, imagine Tokyo for 2050. And so Tokyo, California, we're now having a lot of larger playgrounds that are larger than 23 million of Taiwan.
I feel like a lot of time in the US, you have sort of a moment of public comment, you have community meetings, and specifically thinking about the NIMBY movement, what you often have in the US is the loudest voices ring. You have homeowners in a community who come to a community meeting, and they're the people who might pick up that phone and comment on something if, people are soliciting information. How do you prevent it so it's not just those loud voices or lobbied interests get to sort of take over that platform?
Right. In broadcasting networks, especially on social media, people are either IMBYs or NIMBYs. And those voices, the more extreme they are, the more virality they get. But in conversation networks, in groups of 10, statistically representative of that population, the opposite happens. People become MIMBYs, like maybe in my backyard. People start negotiating different terms, like if I do this, if you do this, and then what would be the group consensus? Because people know only those bridging ideas from that 10 people group will get amplified across other groups and cross-pollinate. So it is very important they're incentivized to find that uncommon ground within the group so that they can gain the virality. So by designing the system differently for broad listening, not broadcasting, you get completely different behavior.
One of the other things that you nodded to here that is critical is transparency. So, who is making the money here? What are their motives behind this? And so I wanted to get really specific. Actually, Audrey, I would love to hear from you. During COVID, you opened up like real-time mass supply data and let hackers audit it. And so can you talk about like which metric convinced you that this radical transparency was literally saving lives and was an important component of the whole process?
So when it comes to Musk, for example, in COVID, transparency is absolutely necessary, but it's just the beginning. We did make it very easy for people using any of those apps developed by civic technologists to look at where the nearest pharmacy hosting the some masks are, how quickly do they replenish, whether this distribution is fair, and so on. But equally importantly, is that when people discover, for example, initially, when we designed the distribution algorithm, we prided ourselves in saying each person in Taiwan on average have a very similar distance to the next available mask. That was the optimization target. But then opposition legislator specializing in data science pointed out not everywhere travel the same speed. So in places with very good metro, for example, the same distance is 10 minutes. But in a rural place, the same distance may take you an hour. And that is actually not fair at all. But the great thing about having historic data published every 30 seconds is that then the minister at the time asked the legislator back, well, you are the expert. How about let's design something that make it much more equal? And she couldn't refuse because she has exactly the same data as the minister. And so they co-created, and within a week, we wrote a much more fair distribution mechanism.
So when we get to the kind of the algorithmic transparency, and you think about AI, do you think it's important to include model weights, or is kind of like process transparency enough? And part of it's because, I do think that one of the things about the model weight stuff is it kind of puts out a kind of a very powerful computation. It's almost like saying, here's a hacking tool or something that it puts it out in the wild. And I tend to be hesitant. I'm curious about, kind of what does it take for transparency and trust? And if Audrey and Divya, if either of you have thought about this, and if you have, kind of insight.
Well, in Taiwan, when we run the alignment assemblies, people prefer tailor-made models not general purpose, very large models, but the ones that are very good in just doing one thing and do it well. For example, translation between Taiwanese Mandarin and English. Do it very well so that it's not just translating the content, but also the local culture, nuances, and so on. And to do that, it probably does not need penetration testing, red teaming, and the other cyber or bio capabilities. And so while we do have very large models, nowadays in Taiwan, our industrial policy around AI is to reuse those models, but to tune specific smaller models through distillations, through synthetic data training, and so on for specific applications. And those models, because they have less dual use risks, can then afford to be much more open weight or even entirely open source.
What do you think are the other current challenges we have in transferring some of these practices from Taiwan around the globe? Like, how can we mitigate those barriers for why people aren't taking you up on all of the amazing things that you guys are doing?
So collective intelligence to me is about exercising mutual care through the civic muscle. And like any muscle, it can be trained and strengthened significantly with patience and practice. However, there's this strain of technosolutionism that is very impatient. There's some people who say, let's just have ChatGPT interview random people one-on-one for a while, and then we build their avatars, and then we put those avatars on the deliberation. And from that point onward, you don't need to check with real people anymore. And this is much better than any polling because there's group dynamics and so on. And that vision is like, sending your robots to the gym to train for you. I'm sure it's very impressive. The robot can lift very heavy weights. At the end of the day, though, the civic muscle atrophies because there's no exercising in listening. So there are some things that we should not outsource. And I think one of the main hurdles was that this kind of technosolutionism, this shortcut, is also capturing some politicians' imaginations. And so we need to work with their expectations and show actually this kind of sick muscle exercise can be done as quickly as emerging technologies. So you do not need to skip those important steps and end up with the avatar state.
As someone who's worked with Audrey in Taiwan and then has tried to bring this to other contexts, I think one difficulty is Taiwan has built up this collective intelligence infrastructure over 10 years. Which means when we run a process in Taiwan, people who are involved believe that it will go somewhere. And I think this is really crucial. And it's why at CIP, we make sure we never run a collective process if we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And we can't say that back to people. Even if the outcome is you're going to be involved in an evaluation, you're going to impact this decision at a company, we're going to bring this to the government, whatever it is. And that's because I think there's cynicism about participation. There's a great Oscar Wilde quote that I say a lot, which is, I love democracy, but it takes too many evenings. Like, of course, it's not what we want to be spending our time on. Even if you do want to participate, you want to make sure it's going somewhere. And I think in a country where that is clear already, there is a much higher desire to participate and higher quality of participation. Forget country, in any context where that's not clear, you're not going to get excellent and helpful participation. And so I think that is what we also need to work on, is success stories of collective intelligence informing things. And the more that happens, the more there's an upward spiral to saying, hey, this can actually work. I would spend an evening on this, perhaps. Or I would create a digital twin to spend an evening on this, which is also something we're thinking about.
Say more about the creating digital twins to spend evenings with. Very interesting.
Well, because I'm kind of obsessed with this question of how do we preserve human agency in a world where it's a lot of work to weigh in on and understand any topic. And we don't want to erode what is core about being human. We don't want to be doing laundry and outsourcing the task of self-governance to AI. Yeah. The idea of a digital twin is, can you create an agent that can negotiate on behalf of your values and preferences in a ton of democratic contexts? I think, Reid, to your earlier point about market solutions, some version of a quote-unquote digital twin is going to be solved by the market, right? It's valuable to have something that can negotiate on your behalf in an agent-based economy. Even if that negotiation is pretty logistics-based, something like that will happen. The question is, how do we know it's actually true to our values? What does it mean to be true to your values in a world where you learn things, or you say something different when you're hungry than when you're full, or you say something different when you're afraid than when you're not? So a lot of we're trying to build evaluations for digital twins using some of the global dialogues data to have people from different places be able to interact with the agents that are trained on their preferences and say, this is what I would say, this isn't what I would say, this isn't what I would say, but actually I like it better than what I would say. And trying to get to the point where even if the market does solve some version of this, we're actually evaluating those and using those for what people truly value. And maybe we can save everyone some evenings and also save democracy.
Well, yes, both evenings and democracy. I thought one of the areas you might have also been going is the Groucho Marx quote, which I also like. Don't want to be part of any club that wants to have me as a member, which also has some echoes here.
I wanted to ask you both a question, which I didn't have a moment for, but I'm curious, like AI and democracy, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? I know we've talked about this on other occasions. We've talked about the hopeful case here. Obviously, that's my day job, so I spend my days being hopeful. But yeah, I'm curious what your high-level bird's eye take is on not just nation-state democracy and AI in the next 2 years, but is transformative AI going to lead to a more or less kind of democratic society?
I think the main problem we have right now is trust in government. Full stop. If people don't trust government, they're not going to vote for it. They're not going to want more of it. And people aren't entirely wrong. In the US, the government does a lot of great things, but they also fail so many times. And so if AI can help the government deliver, if AI can make the government more efficient, more effective, sort of all of these things, then I am incredibly hopeful for this being a positive, because this trust issue is the thing that I care most about.
Obviously, the trust thing is something I also feel very strongly. Part of the reason why, kind of doing this challenge with the Lever for Change organization about restoring trust in public organizations. And the thing that I generally think about optimism, and I think people kind of think that I tend to be optimistic for almost political reasons, but I actually think that the optimism is we only get to futures that are good by steering directly towards them. So I think rationally you need to be optimistic in your efforts, in your intent, in your angle. Now, that being said, obviously it's intelligently optimistic. It's, recognizing there are challenges, recognizing that there's a number of forces that could make things go wrong, and that you have to put in real energy to try to make your optimism bear fruit, to make it that way be the case. And I think that's part of the reason why I'd say, yes, I am optimistic, even though I can see a number of different ways in which, kind of AI can challenge, democracy, can challenge, people's buy-in to democracy, people's buy-in to society with the job transformations.
In a way, I was just going to say, in a way, the primary impact of AI in democracy is economic, right? I think it's really important to bring that piece in.
I completely agree.
If I could squeeze another one in. One question we ask in our global dialogues is sometimes, if you could delegate this decision to like one person or institution, who would you choose? Just to try to understand in a different way what people want, right? We recently did one with the Earth Species Project. And in the pilot, people are always like, nature decisions, Jane Goodall, 100%. Like, it's incredible how big the distance is between that and someone else. I'm wondering, on assuming some type of centralization, this is something we think about a lot, right? Like, what's the leverage point for democracy if it's the bitter lesson all the way down, and some parts of the architecture are just going to be centralized? If you could delegate more control over the centralized architecture to one, like, institution, let's say, because person is a bit difficult, who comes to mind that you'd want to be more involved that isn't? What kind of institution? I know you mentioned you were talking to the Pope before this. So.
Yeah, and actually, while deep respect for the entire, kind of the 1,000 years of 2,000 years of the 1,000+ years of the Vatican studying questions around kind of how various things are integrated into human society. I myself wouldn't necessarily go to a religious institution. Although obviously if we could get a collection of Buddhist monks together, that might be it. That might be an institution that I'd say, okay, that group, that would work. But the And also, by the way, also as a footnote to your thing is, I was the founding donor for the Earth Species Project, and we've had Jane Goodall on the podcast. So
Incredible.
we're at least
Again.
thinking similar patterns and similar terms. I would say, part of it is maybe I'm irreducibly pragmatic about what actually works, and since it tends to be I don't know how we have not yet, despite all idealism, assemble any other way of doing scale technology than companies. I kind of resolve that to a company question. And maybe just because I'm close to the kind of Microsoft processes by being on the board, I tend to have a very high trust for Satya Nadella, Kevin Scott, Mustafa Suleyman in kind of what they're doing, and kind of I know where they've integrated their theses. Now, if it stepped outside of that, I was also on the OpenAI board, so I actually, in fact, have a lot of trust for OpenAI, but I also know Dario Amodei quite well. He was at OpenAI, so Anthropic, I have a high trust for. The Google folks with, Demis Hassabis and the DeepMind folks and James Manyika, I think also, kind of do this very well. And so I actually work towards the answer to your question, which is, getting these folks in dialogue with each other, try to share best practices and ideas, safety tests as ways of doing it, as a way of kind of operationalizing. Like literally all the people I just mentioned to you are people I'm in deep dialogue with about this. And that's part of the reason I have an answer. Now, I don't know if I picking just one. I try not to. I try to get, it's a little bit of the collective intelligence. Like I'm a strong believer in what you guys are doing in terms of collective intelligence and that kind of pattern. So I always try to say, hey, let's try to make it a group of people in dialogue. And matter of fact, one of the questions I ask the version of the question you just asked me kind of regularly of, okay, what's your list of people if you don't create quote unquote AGI? What's your list of other people who you would want to have done that if you're not the person who have done it? And I think that's a very good exercise across the entire industry, not trying to uncork at our very last minute the whole AGI mess of a conversation, which we should also have in some depth at some point, but just as a practice for it.
Okay, so let's do 1/3 C-suite, 1/3 Buddhist monks, 1/3 global public.
Perfect. And so let's turn to rapid fire. Is there a movie, song, or book that fills you with optimism for the future?
Well, there's a line from Leonard Cohen's song Anthem. Goes like this. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. And that's how the light gets in. To me, this is the most optimistic idea. It tells that progress does not come from flawless top-down plans. It comes from embracing our imperfections, allowing new possibilities to emerge from the cracks.
I'm going to go science fiction again. But actually, there are some beautiful explorations of democracy in books like A Half-Built Garden, The Dispossessed, that say, what if you actually use these technologies to counter human flaws instead of magnifying them, which is something we've been talking about. And I think why Terra Ignota in particular is something that fills me with optimism is there's a group of people called the Utopians in the Terra Ignota series. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to reclaim the title of utopian, which I think is often used to dismiss people as naive and idealistic, and for a good reason. The world is really hard, and there are good reasons for it, and it's hard to build utopia. But I think it's important to have an end goal. And in Terra Ignota, this group, they have, they're scientists, they're explorers, they want to defeat death, they want to go to the stars, and they build towards humanity flourishing every day. And that, I think, is something that it is within every person I've spoken to. And bringing that energy together is something that gives me optimism.
Audrey, I'll go to you first. Is there a question that you wish people would ask you more often?
I think questions born from adjacent possible is the best. So, for example, at the beginning of our projects, I wish that everybody would ask, what do you think is possible to achieve if everything works out very well in the next 15 years? That question to me changes dynamic from doom to bloom.
It's coming. Divya?
I wish people would ask me more questions that come from a belief that things can get better. I think in particular with democracy, it is easy to look around and see the failures of democracy. There are tons of them. And if we asked ourselves the question of how do we build on top of this and improve, I think this is true for however you feel about democracy. If you want to preserve what we have now, ask yourself the question of how we can do better. And if you think we should throw it all away, ask yourself the question of what we would lose. If we all asked ourselves the question of how we can make it work, I believe that it would.
Where do you see progress or momentum outside of your quote unquote industry that inspires you?
I'm really inspired by the global movement toward shorter work weeks. We're seeing major pilots and policy shifts from the UK, from Belgium, Iceland, and most recently Tokyo in Japan, showing that 4-day work week can increase productivity and cutting stress and burnout. And I think the civic potential really excites me. An extra free day gives people bandwidth to join citizens' assemblies, to contribute to open source, to mentor neighbors. And so time is the raw material of collective intelligence, and redesigning the calendar is a reminder that not all the gov tech is tech. Sometimes the most profound change begins with something as simple as giving back time.
I think there are two things here. One, I'm constantly inspired by how the billions of people around the world take technology innovation and make it work for them. We said we did these evaluations across India. Obviously, evals are about finding failure modes, but every time we went to an organization to ask them about failure modes, they were using language models in super complex ways. They had downloaded Llama on a laptop that was running without internet. They were all of these kinds of ways of using technology that we don't think about enough and we don't build for enough. I think gives me a lot of excitement. The other thing is science fiction futures are possible. That's always going to be exciting to me. Like I take Waymos now, and I think a lot about how can we push the frontier and make the frontier accessible to people? How can we not have this dichotomy between okay, we keep pushing the frontier and it doesn't get down to people, nor we ignore the frontier because we care about what everyone else gets.
Can you leave us with a final thought on what you think is possible to achieve if everything breaks humanity's way in the next 15 years? And what is our first step to get there? And Divya, why don't you start this time?
I think we can move from a future of artificial general intelligence to a future of augmented collective intelligence. And I think the first step to get there is to bring people and technology together to surface our best ideas and, use AI to put them into action. Basically.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think a change of perspective is all it takes. We need to remember that the superintelligence we're waiting for is not in the server farm somewhere. It is already here. We, the people, are the superintelligence. And our mission is not to look for a mission to save us, it's to increase our own bandwidth, to strengthen our connection, to build the civic muscle, to allow our collective intelligence to emerge. And the first step could be just turning to the person next to you, online or in person, and begin a better conversation.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. This was really incredible and so much to think about. Appreciate it.
Possible is produced by Wonder Media Network. It's hosted by Ari Finger and me, Reid Hoffman. Our showrunner is Sean Young. Possible is produced by Katie Sanders, Edie Allard, Tanasi Delos, Sarah Schleid, Vanessa Handy, Aaliyah Yates, Paloma Moreno Jimenez, and Mulia Agudelo. Jenny Kaplan is our executive producer and editor.
Special thanks to Surya Yalamanchili, Saida Sepieva, Ian Alice, Greg Beato, Parth Patil, and Ben Relis.